There are moments in war that end when the fighting stops, and others that refuse to stay in the past. They follow men home, linger in quiet rooms, and wait patiently for decades without explanation. This story begins not on a battlefield, but with a ringing phone, 37 years after the war was over. On the other end of the line was a voice from another lifetime, a man who had once been an enemy, and then, for 48 impossible hours, something else entirely. The call should not have existed. There was no reason for it, no obligation, no promise ever made. Yet when it came, it reopened a question that had never truly been answered. How could a brief moment of shared humanity survive decades of silence, distance, and memory? And why did it take nearly half a lifetime for two men, bound by war, to finally speak again? It was April the 27th, 1940, and although the calendar said spring, northern Norway was still locked in winter. Snow buried the mountains around Grottli, and the air was sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Above that frozen landscape, Captain Richard Partridge flew patrol in a Blackburn skua, scanning the sky for enemy bombers pushing deeper into occupied territory. The mission was routine, but the war had a way of turning routine into disaster without warning. Far below, the land looked empty and indifferent, but the sky was crowded with danger. When Partridge spotted a lone German bomber pressing on without escort, instinct and training took over. This was what he had been sent here to do. Within moments, calm observation gave way to violence, engines roared, and gunfire shattered the stillness. In the frozen skies above Norway, two aircraft closed in on each other, unaware that this brief encounter would echo for the rest of their lives. Gunfire tore through the thin air, and within seconds, the certainty of combat gave way to chaos. The German bomber lurched as its engine caught fire, trailing smoke as it vanished toward the mountains. Partridge watched it fall, convinced the fight was over, until his own aircraft shuddered in reply. Warning lights flickered, oil pressure collapsed. The skua's engine coughed once, then went silent. In an instant, the hunter became helpless prey. With no power and nowhere friendly to land, Partridge guided the wounded aircraft downward, searching desperately through snow and cloud. He spotted a frozen lake just in time. The landing was brutal but survivable, leaving two shaken men alone in a white wilderness. Miles away, the German bomber met the same fate, crashing hard into the mountains. Uniforms, ranks, and allegiances suddenly meant nothing. Stranded, injured, and cut off from the war they had just fought, both crews were reduced to the same fragile truth. Survival now mattered more than victory. There was no one coming to help. Cold and exhaustion pressed in as daylight faded, forcing both crews to make the same decision: find shelter or die. Partridge and his gunner pushed through deep snow until they saw it, a small hunter's cabin barely visible against the white landscape. Smoke did not rise from its chimney. It looked abandoned, and that alone felt like mercy. Inside, the cabin was dark and silent, but it promised warmth and survival. Moments later, footsteps crunched outside. Voices followed. German voices. The door opened slowly, and for a long second, no one moved. Fear hung heavier than the cold. Weapons were present, but no one reached for them. Instead, hands were raised, then lowered. A nod replaced a shout. In that narrow doorway, enemies stood face to face and chose restraint. The war did not end that night, but for those men, something shifted. Survival mattered more than orders, and humanity spoke louder than fear. Outside, the mountains waited, indifferent witnesses to a moment neither side would ever forget again someday. Morning came quietly. as if the war itself had stepped back to watch. Snow still clung to the mountains, but inside the abandoned hotel near the cabin, there was warmth, light, and the rare comfort of safety. 5 men who had tried to kill each other the day before sat around a table and shared food pulled from forgotten cupboards. Conversation moved slowly, shaped by broken English, hesitant German, and long pauses filled with understanding rather than suspicion. No one spoke of orders or ideology. They spoke of cold hands, damaged aircraft, and the simple relief of being alive. Outside, the war continued without them, but inside those walls, it felt distant and unreal. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Beyond the windows waited violence, capture, and death. At the table was bread, shared glances, and an unspoken agreement to let the war remain outside for just a little longer. For one brief morning, humanity had found space to exist, fragile and temporary, but deeply real in that frozen moment. The fragile calm could not last. War always finds a way back in. When the men finally left shelter together, the mountains closed around them again, cold and unforgiving. It was there that chance intervened. A Norwegian patrol appeared, rifles raised, confusion turning to fear in an instant. One movement, one mistake, and the spell was broken. A German crewman was shot and killed before anyone could stop it. The remaining Germans surrendered and were taken away, bound for years of captivity far from home. Partridge and his gunner were separated as well, eventually escaping Norway, only to be pulled back into the war's machinery. Loss followed them. Capture followed them. Survival carried a cost. Yet beneath everything that came afterward, prison camps, missions, grief, both men carried the same quiet memory. For 2 days, in a frozen corner of the world, the war had loosened its grip, and nothing that followed ever fully erased that truth. Decades passed, and the world rebuilt itself in layers of time and distance. The war became history, then memory, then something spoken of carefully, if at all. Richard Partridge returned to life after captivity, carrying forward, but never quite leaving those days in Norway behind. The same was true for the German pilot who had shared that impossible breakfast. They lived separate lives, in different countries, under different flags, yet the memory endured with stubborn clarity. Neither knew what had become of the other. Neither knew whether the moment had meant as much on the opposite side. Silence stretched year after year, not empty but heavy. Some questions are never urgent, yet they never fade. And through 37 years of ordinary life, one small corner of memory remained unfinished there. When the phone rang in 1977, Partridge hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was older, slower, but unmistakable. It introduced itself carefully, as if afraid the connection might vanish. There was a pause, then recognition. The years fell away. The snow, the cabin, the shared silence returned in an instant. Neither man rushed the moment. They spoke gently, testing memory, confirming details only they could know. Laughter surfaced, unexpected and disarming. So did grief. Names were spoken, losses acknowledged. No apologies were demanded, no explanations required. The call was not about the war they had fought, but about the humanity they had shared. When it ended, nothing in the past had changed, yet everything about it finally made sense. It had waited, and now it was complete. By the time they met again in person, uniforms were gone and the war had lost its power. They were no longer pilots, prisoners, or enemies, just 2 men shaped by the same moment. What began in fear had ended in understanding. The story was never about who won or lost, but about what endured. In a world defined by conflict, their bond stood quietly against it. They had shared a cabin, a meal, and a choice. That choice outlived the war itself. Some friendships are born in peace. Others survive war, time, and silence. Long after history moved on,